I want to show a couple of new editor features that are coming out starting with Illuminated Cloud 2.0.6.7. These two features are not going to be totally game-changing, but I do think that they'll help you understand the code as you browse through it and as you write it, and also have a higher level of confidence as you write dynamic code. Certainly elaborate on that more shortly as I show that feature. We'll go ahead and start with the first feature. It's something called parameter name hints. This is a feature that's already existed in all of the first class supported languages for the JetBrains IDEs, and starting with 2.0.6.7 I've extended the Apex language support to feature it. So let's just take a look. This is a class that, for example, I've got a method I can call and it takes a number of parameters. We'll just say create. And the parameters it takes are, some information about a demographic. And if you call this with literal values, meaning not variables, but actual like string literals, integer literals or numeric literals, Boolean literals, or even enum constants, which are really user-defined literals, it will actually help you understand how those are being used. So let's just take a look. So we'll just say John Smith. And we'll say date.new instance, and we'll say that John was born in the year 2000 on August 1st. And he is registered to vote, and he is gender, he's a male. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at what happened. As you can tell, there are these little tags. Those are parameter name hints that have been inserted beside the literal values that are being passed into these methods. And they give you some insight into how those are being used, because otherwise you would have really no idea without going into the actual implementation of create or using parameter info to bring it up temporarily. You'd have no idea what this true meant. Does it mean is the person a veteran? Does it mean the person's registered to vote as it does here? You'd have no way to know. But now the IDE is actually telling you that the usage of that literal value as passed into that method, it means registered to vote. And that's true of all of these parameters. If instead I'll just go ahead and duplicate this, and I'm going to extract this one occurrence into something called full name. If instead we passed in a variable that hopefully has been named in a descriptive way, or an expression that's constructed in a descriptive way, you'll notice the parameter name hint, it disappears. It's no longer being presented to the user. This is automatic. It's Illuminated Cloud and the base IDE are taking a look at the actual usages and determining whether a parameter name hint should be used. It's also highly configurable. So let's take a look. If you go into settings or preferences, depending upon your base OS, and go into editor general appearance, you'll see show parameter name hints. If you don't want this at all, you can just turn it off. But assuming that you do want this and would find it useful, you can go into configure, and all the languages for which parameter name hints are supported are available in this dropdown. You can see the Apex is now in here. It provides the ability to blacklist certain namespaces, classes, methods of classes, or even call signatures if you don't want parameter name hints to be displayed for those. A good example of that would be system.debug. I think everyone knows that the parameters for system.debug are certainly the single arg version is going to be the message or the object that you want to print, and then there's also an optional logging level. The system.math, if you say math.max, you're providing it a pair of values and you want to know the maximum of those values. So this is actually based on the default blacklist for Java, just kind of extrapolated out for Apex. It's also extensible. So if you wanted to, for example, add some of your own classes, and I'm going to add one here that is a class that I have locally, assert.star. All methods of the assert class, I don't want to blacklist. The assert class is from the Serrano Common Class Library. It's a facade that sits on top of the system.assert methods. And again, we're so familiar with those that generally we don't need to see the parameter hints on those. Although I've often seen the actual and expected values reversed. So perhaps those would be a good one to remove if that's something that you're not sure about when you're writing your tests. So we'll go ahead and do that. There's also options. If you want to show hints for all arguments, not just literals and enum constants and things like that, you can check this option. It tends to be a bit noisy, so it's disabled by default, but if you find this to be an extremely useful feature and just always want to see that, you can always turn this on. The next four are enabled by default. Do not show hints when a method name contains a parameter name. I'll show an example of this in a moment. It'll make more sense. Do not show hints for parameters of builder-like methods. Again, I'll show an example. It'll make more sense. show hints for enum constants. Again, enum constants are not technically literals in the Apex language. They're user-defined constants, and they are treated often as literals or used as literals, so it's often useful to be able to see how they're being used. And show hints for new expressions. So there are two types of invocations. There are method invocations and there are constructor invocations. If you uncheck this, it'll only be shown for method invocations and not constructor invocations. So we'll go ahead and accept that, but it is highly configurable, and we'll take a look at some other usages of it. So let's also take a look at another pseudo literal, and that is the this object. Let's say we want to print a demographic. Notice that it actually shows that this is being passed in as the parameter named demographic. The reason is that the this object or anything referenced to this is rather opaque. I mean, there's a lot of data potentially there. So this gives you some understanding of how that dereferenced object or that dereferenced data being fetched from that object is being used. If we call a method, one of the other options was if we call a method and the single parameter to that method is found in the name of the method, setters, getters, these types of things are good examples of this, then it won't show the actual parameter because we know that John Smith is being used as the full name because the method itself is called setFullName. A builder method would be one where the return type matches the name of the method. So page reference /URL. Extracting the page. Notice it does not actually show the parameter. If we turned off that option, it would actually show param equals URL. And just to show that if it's not an exact match, page reference to /URL, it actually, because it's not an exact match, it actually does show that that parameter is actually param. The point is this should give you quite a bit more insight into how parameters are being passed and used when it would not otherwise be obvious or inferred as you're glancing at the code based on the variable name or the actual expression that's being passed in. Hopefully you'll find this to be a useful feature. And then the second feature is something called language injection, and I think it's best explained just by example. So let's say that we need to use a regular expression in Apex. So we're going to use the pattern class .compile to compile it into a pattern that we can use for multiple matches. And I know that for quite a few people, regular expressions are somewhat of a black art. So knowing exactly what to put here can be challenging. Knowing whether you have a valid regular expression can be challenging. Also knowing if things are properly balanced and will compile. So let's take a look at what's going to happen here. So we'll just go ahead and say that we start with a word boundary. And notice that it's already given me syntax validation. Start with a word boundary and then say that we have one or more word characters. And if I want to know what that is, I can actually take a look. I'm just going to use completion and take a look at \w. And I can say it's a word character and actually shows me the character class that represents. And then I can say we want a parentheses, so not a capturing group, but a parentheses. And then $? and close parentheses, and that'll be it. And so this will be my actual extract into a variable. This will actually be my pattern that I've extracted. Call that P. And let's just take a look at some of the things. So we do get validation. If we actually had an extra encoding character there or escape character, then it would warn us of that and actually tell us a legal unsupported escape sequence. And we can also even test it from here. So I can check the regular expression. And what we wanted to have was, so if I say something like Scott, that matches. If I put a space before, that doesn't match the word boundary. And so that doesn't match. Things like that. So we can actually test our regular expression right here. Very useful. And another thing that I'll point out is that this works fine with string concatenation. If we're going to build this up from a series of strings or even from something like userinfo.getUsername, and that was going to be part of it, that all works. It understands how to continue to do the language injection with string concatenation expressions. What if we actually define this as string my regexp equals, and we'll just say \w plus just for simplicity. Notice there's no highlighting. And then later we want to say something like pattern.matches my regexp, comma, Scott. Well, we can actually force this to be injected. It's going to automatically inject on pattern.compile in the first argument of pattern.matches. But we can say language equals regexp, And notice that it now automatically injected. You can see that the syntax highlighting turned on. It is validating things like that. So hopefully this will help folks as they're working with regular expressions in Apex. The same thing holds in other languages. So if you're using regular expressions in JavaScript, in IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate Edition or WebStorm, same thing will hold. There's another language injection here, and it's for dynamic queries. So we'll say database.query, and again, it's going to understand that when you're in the context of an invocation of database.query, that it can automatically start injecting. And now we can even start using, for example, our live template. So we'll just use the SEL live template. We'll select from this account number where last modified date is greater than yesterday. Okay, and so the interesting thing about this is that there's no reason that you would actually write a query like that as a dynamic query, because it's static in nature. So the power of a dynamic query, and again, I'm showing that the string concatenation operator works just fine here as well. The power of a dynamic query is being able to actually build the query dynamically in a way that you can't do in a static manner. And so let's just say that we had a list of strings, my account IDs, and we'll just stub them for the moment, and we'll say where and ID in, and I can even use bind variables here. Again, at this point, it's no different than a static query. I could actually write that as a static query. But now let's do something a little bit different, and let's extract this as a variable. All right, we can use a similar type of forced injection. The language in this case is actually going to be Apex. And the reason it's going to be Apex is because the Illuminated Cloud Apex parser includes the parsers for the query languages, the inline query languages. So it recognizes this as a query. It's actually highlighting it. And let's just go ahead and break it up and say that we don't want this expression. And so we'll say if true, obviously we would use a more complex expression, then we'll say my query plus equals, and we'll just do that right there and add on that clause. And again, we can say language equals Apex, and we're good syntax highlighting. Now, one thing I will point out is this snippet, it does not automatically connect it with this query up above. So you notice last modified date, there's no reference being injected into it. You'll still get syntax highlighting. It will not actually show it as being invalid, even though it's just a fragment of SOQL. But the nice thing is you do start to get syntax highlighting and at a glance understanding of the query that you're constructing. And so this is a very useful feature if you're doing dynamic queries, if you're having to use regular expression. I hope that you do find this useful. Thanks.